Hi everyone. In today's podcast, we are going to discuss the topic of faith. What does it mean, faith? How can we define such a word within the context of a believer and within the context of the Islamic religion mainly, since we are developing here Islamic studies? First of all, we have to say that faith indeed is the first thing that the believer must cultivate within himself. Without faith, there can be anything else. Therefore, it's the first thing. And we have mentioned briefly in other podcasts that regarding faith, we could define it, or we could ascribe to it knowledge and belief. And going even more deep, the Arabic word for faith is iman, and literally it means to know, to believe, to be convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt. Therefore, we could say that faith is the firm belief arising out of knowledge and conviction. Without knowledge, there cannot be conviction, because to be convinced, you have to have knowledge of something. You have to have knowledge of God, knowledge of His book, knowledge of reward and punishment, knowledge of the day of judgment, knowledge of what He expects from you, knowledge from the sacred law of God. Therefore, knowledge is the very important aspect right here. From knowledge, then you become convinced, and when you have a strong knowledge and strong conviction, then we could say that you have faith, that you have iman. Therefore, this is a very important aspect to consider, because the believer must have a strong conviction rooted deep in his mind. There cannot be a shadow of doubt. Therefore, someone who has such a strong conviction and faith, then his behavior shows that he is indeed a servant of God, that he is a believer. And we call someone whose qualities, whose behavior, who believes in the oneness of God, who walks humbly and following God, what God expects from him, we call him a mu'min, a faithful. And such faith must direct man into a life of active obedience to the will of God Almighty. Therefore, we have to understand that these aspects that we just mentioned are indispensable, essential, the starting point for the believer. This could be compared to a tree. Faith could be compared to a tree, to its seed. A tree cannot sprout forth without its seed. In the same way, it is not possible for a man who doesn't have any belief to begin with to become a believer. And just as a tree might not grow from a planted seed, and even if it sprouts, its growth may be impaired or retarded, in the same way, a man may have faith, but due to a number of weaknesses or deficiencies, he might not become a true and, let's say, staunch believer. Therefore, we emphasize that strong faith is the starting point for a believer. Now, we could classify all men into 4 categories according to the concept of faith that we have just explained. First of all, there are those who have a firm faith, a faith that makes them completely and wholeheartedly submit to God. They follow the system of God and devote themselves completely to seeking His pleasure. They do everything He likes and avoid all that He dislikes. In fact, their love of God is greater than their love for themselves. And they show indeed extreme devotion. They're very, very devout, very pious. And such men with such behavior, we could say they are top, number one, actual, very, very, very strong believers. Now there is a second classification of men according to their faith. There are those who have faith, who believe in God, in His rules, in the day of judgment, and all the other things, but whose faith is not deep and strong enough to make them totally submit to God. Yeah, they know these things, but the way they practice and they serve God is not really deep, not strong connection. Then there's a third category. There are those who do not possess faith at all. These people refuse to acknowledge the sovereignty of God, and indeed they are rebelling in certain way against God's laws, because the simple fact that we have been created by a creator and we have certain rules to follow, and if we don't follow those rules and we don't do what God expects from us, we are technically rebelling against Him. We are His servants, and we must obey what He expects and do what He expects from us. And as a result of this, He's going to reward us for our good behavior, because at the end, whatever we do is for our own good. Now there are some people, like I said, who do not have this faith at all. They refuse to acknowledge the sovereignty of God. They say, oh, God is not in charge here. I'll do whatever I want. Maybe there are some people whose behavior is not that bad. They try to behave as such normal human beings, but still they refuse to acknowledge God, that God is the King of the universe, and they say, I'll do whatever I want. So this is a kind of classification of these men according to the concept of within this framework. Now there is a fourth classification, and there are those who neither possess faith nor do good deeds, because the previous ones I just said, they don't have faith and they don't acknowledge God to be the creator or in charge of everything, but they might behave good. They might try to live as good citizens. Now, but there are some people who don't have faith and they behave very bad. So these people spread disorder in the world, corruption, perpetrator of all kind of violence and oppression and robberies, and these people are criminal and wrongdoers. These are the worst of the worst. And indeed, we could say that more or less all people in the world fall within these four categories. And I will repeat briefly. Number one, those who have a firm faith and behave accordingly, wholeheartedly following and submitting to God, following God's law and submitting to God. Number two, those who have faith, who believe in God and in all what we know that God expects from us, but their faith is not that deep, it's not that strong. There's not that strong connection. Number three, there are those who don't have faith at all, and they don't acknowledge God at all, but they try to behave as good citizens, we could say. And then there are others, number four, who don't have faith and neither do good deeds. They just behave badly and do all kind of wrong things, and they are wrongdoers and criminals and really, really bad behavior. Therefore, in conclusion, we could say that man's real success and salvation depend on faith. The life of obedience is born from the seed of this faith. Therefore, without faith, we cannot say that there is a believer. Because if you don't have faith, then you don't have conviction. That means you don't have neither knowledge. And then it's complicate things. And someone who doesn't have faith is a non-believer. And therefore, it is the requirement, as we have explained, to have knowledge, to have a strong conviction rooted deep in the mind of the believer. And as we have explained, this is what it means to have faith. This is the meaning of faith: to be convinced beyond a shadow of doubt. This is the true believer. In upcoming podcast, we are going to explain how then could we acquire the knowledge of God that is so important for someone to have faith, to become a believer, to become convinced, and to apply such knowledge in his life and behave in the proper way that God expects from all of us, in the proper way of a believer. Thank you so much, and we'll see each other in the next podcast.